Hey fam, I wanted to speak about just a critical approach to reading the Bible. And I don't want to overstep my confidence here because I'm a lay person just like you might be a lay person. And so this is really like, I think, lay people like me and you, advanced general readers. I'm pretty confident. I'm somewhat optimistic that we can become at least conversationally competent in highly specialized areas. That doesn't mean that we will become the experts. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden people should start seeking us as like the first place to get their evidence or explanations or whatever. But I am optimistic that advanced general readers and lay students can be involved in the scholarly conversation. It's important that I try to provide resources to you. If you watch some of my content, I'm always trying to name drop authors or books or resources or commentary that I think would be useful for a critical examination of the biblical literature. And so I'm all about kind of developing our skills and encouraging us all to do that. I think that's the way that we stop listening to an interpretive community telling us how we have to hear the text, and we start thinking about how might we examine the text on our own and draw from commentary traditions and try to arrive at some of our own conclusions, or if not even arriving at our own conclusions, better understanding what the scholarly consensus may be. Now, this doesn't mean that we appeal to authority in all cases, but it does mean that I think, we can develop some general competence in the area of critical biblical scholarship. I'm optimistic about that. I hope that I've qualified my statements enough. I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden overnight we're going to become interpreters of the text. We're going to always have to rely on the scholarly consensus if we are non-scholars. I'm not a scholar. I'm a lay student. I read a lot of scholars, but I'm not presenting original papers at academic conferences, but I am reading the papers that are presented at academic conferences, if that makes sense. So a critical approach to reading the Bible. What I want people to understand is that the project here, you cannot just open up to Genesis 1:1 and be like, okay, today we're going to read the Bible critically. That doesn't make any sense because the Bible is not written with one perspective and one voice and one thing to argue, and it's only about one thing. We know that we have a multivocal text from many different authors, from many different historical periods, many different cultural touch points, etc. So we always have to have that kind of multivocality in mind. It's really useful to know the general dates of composition, the general sources that are under investigation. So if it's in the Hebrew scriptures and the Torah in particular, it is useful to know that the documentary hypothesis or the neo-documentary hypothesis started by suggesting, didn't start by it, but I suppose in its modern formulation, if we attribute it to Richard Elliott Friedman, the JEDP account, that you've got these four major sources in the composition of the Pentateuch or the Torah. At any rate, you've got some general guidelines. Now, do all scholars agree on documentary or neo-documentary hypothesis? No, they don't. Just like in the Greek scriptures and the synoptic problem, there's a Farrer hypothesis, there's a two-source hypothesis. But understanding the general source critical approaches, understanding the general dates of authorship, understanding the general ideas about the communities of biblical authorship, that's really important stuff just to know before we even begin to have a critical approach to the biblical literature. So it's not something that you can just do tomorrow. It requires years, truly like years of study. I think that's the important thing to crawl out here is that it's not merely years of listening to your interpretive leaders tell you how to hear the text, but it includes like reading a lot. You know what I mean? Always engaging with the literature, always understanding what the going debates are, understanding what the consensus positions are, but then some of the minority positions as well. All of that is required before you just start reading the Bible critically. But as you develop some of that background knowledge, some of those background beliefs, and you bring those to bear on the text, the critical project always starts with formulating a research question or with discovering some curious observation and then seeking to explain that curious observation. That's always the first step. You've got to have a question in mind. Now, that doesn't mean that your whole project will always be governed by merely one question. I think a question in research is most successful when you can reformulate the question and then do it again and then generate more questions. All of research is just a practice of refining questions over time. And you get some findings along the way, but those findings are often brought in service of just reformulating your question yet again. So the research project rarely is something that we're like, okay, we're done. We answered that. Let's move on. There are consensus positions that we get to, and there are things that by and large is the kind of the going majority view. So you kind of just take that on board and then take the next step forward. But it should just be said that in light of new evidence, you're always revising your research questions. You're always updating your prior beliefs. You always need to be responsive to new evidence. But that gets into a whole thing about theory construction and theory change. And while that makes my philosophy of science mind happy, I won't allow us to get off track on that right now. Now, once you have your question in mind, then you start to seek evidence. But what you should do is that the question that you have in mind or the curious observation you're seeking to explain, that should draw in some boundaries for where you will gather your evidence. So if I'm trying to answer a question about something about the gospel accounts, for example. Now, maybe the anonymous author to Mark's gospel said, I'm going to quote Isaiah. And so then you're in the boundary of your research space. Now you've brought in Isaiah. Now, because you brought in Isaiah, then maybe you're understanding that there's kind of three different Isaiahs, Deutero-Isaiah, Trito-Isaiah, etc. So then you're understanding about these different phases of authorship of Isaiah. And then maybe that's drawing you to some historical analysis of the pre-exilic, exilic, and post-exilic communities after Babylonian exile or something. So you are kind of bringing in and manipulating the boundaries of your research question. But do you see how it's all principled? It's all coming off of this central question that you thought to answer in the first place. Why did the Markan author bring in Isaiah at this particular place? So you're still bound by the boundaries of your research question. Does that make sense? So as you begin to generate evidence, then you're going to infer some conclusions. You're going to try to offer some explanation for your curious observation or your research question. But the evidence that you're drawing should be bound by your research question. And then the conclusions that you infer should only be brought to bear on the research question. So you can't be like, why did Mark bring in Isaiah? And then all of a sudden try to claim something about what's happening in John. You've got to have a principled way to connect Isaiah to Mark to John, right? I mean, do you see how this, they're all nodes in a network. It all has to make sense together. And the conclusions that you infer have to also be bound by the research question. So let me contrast this with another way to read the Bible. Another way that is a very popular way for people to read the Bible when they want to establish and maintain control and power. You might look to the biblical literature and you might say, okay, look at this passage and this passage and this passage. And then that means in the 21st century, this behavior is permissible and this behavior is impermissible. Well, what you've done then is you've taken ancient evidence, you've brought it outside of its scope, and you've tried to infer a conclusion about today in the 21st century. Do you see how that's different than narrowing your research question, only gathering evidence as it is pertinent and can be explained by the nodes in the network of your research question, and then bringing your conclusions to bear on the boundaries of the same research question? Why did Mark bring in Isaiah? So you go to Isaiah and then you go back to Mark and then you say, well, Mark brought in Isaiah here because he was trying to argue for this point. So everything is within the boundaries you've established by your research question. If you're going to the Bible and you're saying, well, in Leviticus it says this, and then Paul says this over here in Romans, and then you say, so that means for us today, we are... we must do this or we must not do this. Now you're just kind of picking and choosing and inferring a conclusion for today, which is very different than a principled approach to drawing in the boundaries of your research question, only operating within that research space, drawing evidence from those boundaries, and then inferring conclusions that apply to those boundaries. A very different project than saying, the Bible says this, so you must do this today. Do you see how those are different? And so maybe understanding that critical approach to the Bible helps us to see a little bit what's wrong with an inappropriate application of the biblical evidence to today. Critical reading of the Bible versus an uncritical reading of the Bible. Maybe that's helpful. That was 9.5 minutes. It's like 9 in the morning. I got to get to work. I'm out. Peace. Much love.